Alrighty. What is an expert? That is the subject today. Welcome back to SciWorthy, your home for raw, unfiltered, informal conversations on science. I am Adrian, climate scientist, crafter, and amateur philosopher, amongst many other things. I definitely wanted to get into this particular question today on what does it mean to be an expert? What is an expert, more precisely? And because actually I was kind of inspired by one of the pieces I found when I was thinking about topics for this video. And I was also going back, so in my last video, just like I told you, I'm a scientist with a PhD and all that good jazz, all of it. Not the most important thing necessarily to me. Well, don't get me wrong, I'm really proud of having my PhD, but I would rather be related to as a person than just an expert myself. As some could call me an expert depending on how you define it, and is which we're going to get into today. But I was thinking about 4 years ago when I finished my PhD, and some years prior when I was doing my prelim exam, my PhD mentor at the time, my committee chair, co-chair actually, had a question for me on the prelim exam that was really similar to this whole idea of what does it mean to be an expert in something. So yeah, we're going to get into that, and then I will bring up the piece, of course, that inspired me to think about this particular question in science about what does it mean to actually be an expert. But let's start where the basics are with the dictionary. So, I mean, of course, you've got one definition of expert is a noun, a person with a special skill or knowledge representing mastery of a particular subject. Okay, that's one way to think about it. Expert's also an adjective in the dictionary, having involving or displaying special skill or knowledge derived from training or experience. So notice there's a little bit more there with that of like knowledge versus knowledge that's derived from training or experience. And then, of course, we have the stupid third definition, and I say stupid because they use circular definitions. The intransitive verb, to serve as an expert. Expert as a verb means to serve as an expert. Good job, Merriam-Webster. Really, you had to use a circular definition, but I digress. So, from these two definitions above, because I really don't think the third one's all that great, you get the sense of expert being something to do with knowledge or special skills or training or experience, and usually with a particular subject in mind. But as I did kind of last time, I thought it would be useful to go back into the history of the word, both the noun and the verb version of expert. Where did it come from? What was its particular root? Because it also has to do with some of the interesting things therein. So, like, the adjective expert comes from the late 14th century in the English language with some experience, meaning having had experience or skillful from the old French in here, but it goes all the way back to the word expertus, or experitus in there from the Latin, which means tried, proved, known by experience. So it's not just knowledge, it's experience or knowledge from experience is where we get the word expert in some of these things, which is certainly interesting. But of course, you can go further with this with past participles and things like that you can read here, meaning to try, to test, experienced, tested, as in, tested in fire, something like that. Gold tested in fire, for instance. The noun version of it is early 15th century, meaning person wise through experience. And I kind of hinted at it the other day. Wisdom versus knowledge is an interesting thing. I may do a whole video on that where it's just what's the difference between wisdom and knowledge in the philosophical sense of it. So in the legal sense, the person who, by virtue of special acquired knowledge or experience on the subject, presumably not within the knowledge of men generally, and may testify in a court of justice matters, opinion therein, Okay. So you get the gist of dictionary definitions and etymology and what have you. That is about knowledge. Okay, that's great. About knowledge or knowledge from experience or knowledge that's based from training. In that sense, you can argue that I'm an expert in climate science because of PhD and now however many peer-reviewed studies and all this kind of stuff. I've done a lot of work in that. I'm an expert in that. That's one thing you could argue on my case. I actually, of course, would not consider myself an expert in plumbing or electric or anything like that. Like the wonderful handyman who came to my house yesterday and actually was taking care of some issues in my house. He's an expert on that, and I respected that expertise. And that's going to play in, I think, here when we get to the end. But I wanted to go real quick to this particular piece, because what inspired me to talk about this topic a little bit was this piece from Quillette, actually, which I know some people out there probably watching this don't think much of Quillette, but I actually really like Quillette in that they publish essays that are often very thoughtful, very well written, very thought-provoking. So back on MLK Day, there was a great piece written by a philosopher in Quillette that was talking about the philosophy of personalism, and how it was shown in MLK's writings, and how MLK was actually trained in personalism as a philosophy. But this piece really caught my attention with the idea of the value of knowledge. And if we're thinking about experts as people with knowledge, particularly in a lot of knowledge in a particular subject, whether that knowledge is drawn from training or from experience, then are we missing something? I always ask, and this particular article pointed to something that I don't think too many of us think of, or we just sort of, I guess, implicitly think of it as being valuable. And that's the idea of critical thinking, which I don't think is necessarily great. So a little chunk from this article here says, while it is a bit simplistic to put it like this, the goal of education is to produce experts in various fields, be they historians, carpenters, or neurosurgeons. So teachers and educators ought to be concerned with the question of what makes an expert an expert. And I actually agree with this to a certain degree, and particularly as you get more and more specialized going into academia, being trained at a university for anything, whomever is doing the teaching needs to be concerned with what makes an expert great themselves. And this pointed out something that's obviously not in the dictionary definition here in the next section, is the idea that, okay, one of the things we value experts for is the ability to evaluate and solve problems. But I don't think that we necessarily remember that critical thinking is kind of an important part of that process, to be able to think critically in here. And this particular author, I'll provide a link for this in the description for the video, but this particular author talks a lot about critical thinking and the relationship between critical thinking and knowledge. And I really love this when I was thinking about it from the perspective of an expert in sciences in particular, whether it be climate science or psychology or anthropology or any number of the different sciences, hard or soft, as we put it, physical sciences or social sciences. Thinking critically is really important. And, critical thinking of just as a teachable skill is something that may be good across context, but critical thinking without knowledge is really kind of hard. And that's the point that the author gets to in this particular piece. And it's actually something, as I was thinking about it, that I quite agree. You can think critically, but if you don't necessarily have a lot of knowledge about it, you don't necessarily know the sort of best things to do, the best questions to ask, where to go, how does that knowledge apply to my life kind of thing. Well, not to my life, to society writ large. How does it relate to answering a question that's been asked of you? So critical thinking, as John Dewey described it, here as they talk about in the book How We Think, he described it as the idea of lots of persistent, active, and careful considerations of any belief or supposed form of knowledge in the light of the ground that supports it, and the further conclusion to which it tends. Critical thinking, then, he comes down to its elemental components: doubting, searching, and concluding. And this is actually really related in a lot of ways, at least as I see it, to the scientific method. We have a hypothesis. We're asking a question. We want to know the answer to that question. Sometimes we have an expectation for how that question, what the answer to that question is, but we then spend the time searching, doing analysis, ultimately coming to a conclusion that we hope is, of course, accurate about that. And Dewey held that this is a process to be learned and honed. And to a degree, I agree with this. But the thing is, this author for Quillette is actually quite right. Dewey misses one thing that's kind of critical from it here, because anybody can think and run through that kind of process, but thinking critically also requires some amount of knowledge. And this is where it comes right back to the experts kind of thing. If you have knowledge about something, then you can think even more critically about it than you did. What the? Technical difficulty here. Even more critically about it than you did before. I apologize if something goes wrong. My mic is acting a little weird today. We're going to have some problems with that. But thinking critically, yeah, you have to have knowledge. You have to be doubting something. You have to then go through and, search for an answer. And that whole process of critical thinking is very strongly related to the scientific method, as I already said. So I think specifically for an expert in science, they're also going to be an expert in critical thinking in a way. And we would expect them to be. That makes sense that one would expect them to be an expert in critical thinking. This is not necessarily always the case. I have run into some experts who I think are unfortunately not very good at all at critical thinking and just take whatever they want and just go from there. And yeah, that's kind of a thing here that seems to be missing. But the question that I have looking at this with critical thinking versus knowledge in here is, how much knowledge do you need to think critically? Do you need a little? Do you need a lot? And I think to a degree, any knowledge is really helpful to do thinking critically. And what makes an expert then in a particular field is a lot of knowledge and the ability to think critically about all of that knowledge from that particular subject in which they are an expert. I don't think that's the only thing that makes an expert. I think we'll get to the end of this little video and you'll find there's a couple of other things that I think makes an expert. And how do you define an expert? What is an expert? To me, someone who is an expert, yes, they have critical thinking. They have a huge amount of knowledge, more so than I would ever have in a field. And this is where, of course, you get to some interesting conversations about experts and elitist tendency and a few other kinds of things. But I really enjoyed this particular piece from Quillette, and I encourage you to go read it if you get the chance. I will link it in the description, as I said. So, yeah, so Hirsch here, E.D. Hirsch, who's a professor of education at the University of Virginia, has also written, he defines something interesting about expertise. I'm not 100% sure that I agree with it, having knowledge, but he also talks about it as having access to a schema of knowledge, a networks of links and facts that encompasses everything a person knows. And this schema is how we then understand new concepts and theories. I wonder, with an expertise in this, whether or not that schema that he talks about, because I think in a way that he's right, that knowledge is a network of links and facts. It's not necessarily just one honed-in thing, although if you get into the ivory tower and you're dealing with academics where all they do is study dust in the atmosphere, for instance, they're great experts on that. But all that works for them is dust in the atmosphere, and that's all they know. And I do know some scientists who are like that. That's all they study is dust and aerosols. And not the only thing. There's some folks who are very focused in their field and don't do very much in terms of interdisciplinary work. And that's what I mean by that. Their knowledge is hyper specialized. And I think they're still an expert, though their schema is very narrow. They have a narrow selection of facts and links and things going on there. But at the same time, maybe they can be a hyper great expert, perhaps, but also then be not having as much knowledge in a field, perhaps not as able to think critically about another field. But at the same time, critical thinking involves doubt. And doubt inherently gives you search for knowledge, which gives you a little bit wider schema, which then gives you a little bit more expertise in another field. So this is where it gets really interesting to me, is that you could put it on a range of expertise, maybe, and connect that range to what is the depth or the width or the size of the schema that somebody has access to with respect to knowledge. So is your network of links and facts encompassing everything a person knows? Okay. New concepts and theories. Yeah. Okay, maybe so. But, do you have... There's a saying that's jack of all trades and master of none. In a lot of ways, an expert is a master of a trade, or very close to mastery of a trade, but could not be very much somebody of all trades, and they'd be relying on the expertise of others. But this is where this author gets into it a little bit more with what is an expert. And I do think an expert is somebody who is very masterful, full of knowledge, can critically think, as I already said, and perhaps has they can have a narrow schema, perhaps, but it doesn't have to be narrow. They could be wider and very knowledgeable in other fields at the same time. So I almost wonder with Hirsch's arguments here is if they have a slightly less wide schema. And I'm thinking off the top of my head as I'm reading this. So some of this is not going to be entirely cogent. But I encourage you, hey, go read this and see what you think, along with a couple of the other things that I have today. And so, yeah, what is the relationship there between the idea of schema and what have you? So we have the idea, I really think, with different sizes of schema, you can have experts who are very, very knowledgeable in very, very narrow field, but their schema is then also very small. Or like really concentrated in an area, but maybe very sparse in other types of knowledge that they have. Maybe that's a better way to describe it. At the same time, we also look for really, how do you define an expert? How do you identify one here? And some interesting things. There's really this particular author in Psychology Today from a couple of years ago. He points out the truth. Honestly, there's not an ironclad criteria for what does it mean to be an expert. How do you pick somebody who is an expert in something when you're making a decision? There's some soft criteria maybe that you could pay attention to. Actually, when I was reading this particular list the other day and thinking about the experts in my field and why do I call them experts? Because I'm one climate scientist of many, but there are other experts too. And this is the thing. Some experts in the field can consider other people even more expert, have more expertise than they do in their field, or be experts in particular subtopics that, I am not, for instance. So, yeah, some of these things I would say are really important to expertise here, and successful performance. So in sciences, a lot of successful performance is making good decisions. This is not necessarily making good decisions for scientists as much as the scientific community considers it. How many papers have you published, in which journals, and how many grants have you won? For this, I wonder, with making good decisions, that goes into something that I may talk about here in a little bit right at the end, because what does successful performance mean for a scientist when you're in a field that might be a little politicized as climate science is? Somehow I think that's different, what successful performance is and whether or not you call that an expert. Peer respect, to be honest, I will be perfectly honest, I never consider how much a person is respected by their peers as important in my decision on whether or not somebody's an expert in my own field. And sometimes in others too. I consider how much like a doctor is recommended to me. Then I can consider that. But I honestly don't care with respect to experts in my own field. I really don't care how many awards they've won. I don't care how many other scientists who are a similar level or a little younger or a little older. I don't care how much they respect that other person. Because I look at their performance, I look at their work, and that's actually more important to me when I evaluate how good, whether that person is an expert or I think they're an expert. So I was like, I ran across somebody who actually claimed to be an expert in climate modeling and then subsequently made a whole group of fundamentally incorrect statements about what climate models are and how they work. Yeah. You can be respected by others. You lost my respect because you are clearly not an expert in the field as much as you think you are. So I do my own evaluation of people's work. And I encourage others to do that. If you have the capability, go evaluate somebody's work and what they've done themselves. Don't necessarily go off of how many awards somebody has won, because Lord only knows we give awards to each other all the time. Career, how many years have they been? Yes, that is a good thing because that is more experience. And experiential knowledge is important when it comes to being a scientist. You know which kinds of questions to ask and types of analysis, and you can hopefully get more creative with your analysis. As an expert, or you get better at answering questions because you know more over experience and training than other things. Mental models, Quality of tacit knowledge, yeah, that one I'm not worried. Reliability, ooh, that can be fun in the public eye. Yeah, that might be, something, reliability there is certainly an interesting thing. Credentials, this goes back to pure respect. I honestly don't consider awards to be all that important. I don't consider where you got your degree to be important to me. That doesn't make you an expert. This last one, though, I think is actually really important when it comes to experts in the public eye, and the respect of scientists in the public eye, which, by the way, if you missed our SciWorthy conversations on SciWorthy.locals.com about the trust in and perception of scientists, I think we did hit on this a little bit, this whole topic here, but you should go join SciWorthy and check it out, because you're not going to see that conversation on YouTube. Sorry, I'll link it in the description for you. You can go join SciWorthy.locals.com to see that conversation on the trust in and perception of scientists. But this reflection comment, I think, is actually really, really important, because, asking somebody what mistake they make, usually experts are perfectionists. Some of the best that I've found are absolute perfectionists, and they get annoyed when something goes wrong. And particularly for climate scientists, I know, at least for me, one of the reasons I work myself so hard and I want to make sure that the analysis is right is because at this point with climate science, we're using the data in so many ways to help out with decisions related to planning in a changing climate or adaptation or mitigation or what have you. And we want to make sure it's right. Want to make sure the models are good, which is why I spend so much time evaluating climate models myself nowadays. And they do good things and they do bad things. That's a whole topic for a whole nother day. But yeah, do you have a scientist that's willing to give you a mea culpa? It's my bad when I screwed up. That ability to reflect is actually really, really important to me. And then being sincere about it, of course. And that's going to connect to something else, because there's a lot of credibility. And one of the things we forget is that scientists are human. Scientists are fundamentally human. They are subject to all the same flaws that any other person might have, including trying to do something for their own gain, even though 99% of the time, a lot of scientists are really good people and really good intentions, and they want to answer questions and help society. That doesn't make them immune to all the temptations that come with just being human. And often they say that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, it turns out. So there is that. And that's where I wanted to get to with this. So a friend of mine in another locals group posted this photo and was asking about credibility. And that's another word that goes along with expertise, because often we assume experts are credible. They're really knowledgeable. They're really specialized. We can believe them. We can trust them all the time. They're credible. Capacity for belief, quality, capability, or power to elicit belief. In other words, when an expert says something, you want to believe them. You think they're right because they have lots of expertise and knowledge, and they often are. This is to their credit. A lot of experts are often right about what they do. But this is why the mea culpa thing becomes so important to me when I'm judging somebody's expertise, because if they're willing to give a sincere mea culpa when they screw up, and scientists do screw up, that actually adds to a person's credibility. But if people know you screwed something up as an expert, and I know you screwed something up as an expert in particular, and you're not willing to say, I blew it. I'm sorry. I failed. That is actually where I lose a lot of respect for that person as an expert. And I almost stop counting them as an expert anymore because you're not credible. You've lost your credibility as the credibility of your expertise that your expertise gives you. And so, if you want to be credible about something, if you want to be considered an expert in my mind, and I think it's quite possible in a lot of the public too, please comment and tell me, you've got to be willing to give the mea culpa. So building on this whole thing of what I think an expert is, they have lots of knowledge. They might have very concentrated field of knowledge, or they could be a bit broader with respect to that field. They get that expertise from training, knowledge from training or from experience. But they're also, willing to be credible. They get a successful track record in most cases. They're often right. But when they're not right, a particular characteristic that I look for in an expert is this aspect of a mea culpa, which helps with the person's credibility. You're not credible to me if you're not going to take an expert, if you're not going to take a mea culpa when you screw things up. And that leads me to the next thing, because one of the reasons I was inspired to do this particular piece, this particular video next, was the idea of, we keep hearing in the news, trust the experts. The experts say. And there comes a bit of an authority there, but that's a little bit connected to the appeal to authority fallacy sometimes when you're doing arguments. Well, the experts say this, so we should. Well, that's not necessarily a great thing for an argument, but it leads, and that's a whole other topic for another day, I should say, but it leads to another thought of, yes, it's bad to just say the experts are wrong, they don't know what they're doing, to be anti-intellectual, and we saw that a lot in the last many years, actually, not just the last 4, but even years before that, where you just can't trust the experts. They're out for themselves. And there is some of that shows up in polling when it comes to experts. And so some published studies that talk about the integrity of a scientist and the integrity of experts, and we don't trust them if they don't have integrity, doing things with good intentions in mind. But the opposite, I think, is also bad. So this is a great article in Medium, actually. Should we trust experts to think for us? So Aristotle, when he was talking about virtues and vices, Aristotle actually has, for every virtue, not one vice, but 2, because he looked at virtues as being sort of a balance in here. On the one end, you had one kind of virtue that was really bad, on the vice that was really bad. On the other end, you had another type of vice that was also really bad, and in the middle, you have virtue. And the virtue is what you want to shoot for, which is a bit of a balance between both vices. Which is really interesting in Aristotle's view, which informed a lot of Western philosophy. And that's the fun thing about it. So, like a good example is being prideful about something when you are not worthy of that something. You're not worthy of feeling prideful of that. That's a vice. On the other hand, there's the vice of you are worthy of something, but you don't feel worthy of it. The virtue in the middle is being proud and being worthy of whatever you are proud of. So that's the kind of thing that he would get into. I'm not describing it quite right. I know that because there's a couple of different words that he used. But yeah, blinding trusting experts, I don't think is a good thing either. And that's because experts are human in here. And this is a really fascinating story this author goes through of, why, where is it? So yeah, for the past month, I've had nagging concerns about whether our response to the coronavirus pandemic may be inflicting greater harm than the virus itself. I've had a friendly Facebook debates on the subject with my friend Adam. He's a college-educated entertainment executive who thinks lockdown protesters are selfish and idiotic for wanting to get back to work so they can feed their families. After hitting a wall in our latest exchange, I sent him a link to a Medium article I wrote, hoping it would help him understand the other side. 5 minutes later, this is what I got. I don't think you or I or anyone else knows more than the world's health experts. You're not an epidemiologist. The lockdowns need to continue. The collective questioning and by deniers and skeptics will end up killing more people. Stop adding to the chorus of the uneducated. Let the experts tell us what to do. So here's the thing. This is where I get really concerned because he's not thinking himself at this point. Blindly trusting experts means you're not thinking and you are not applying your own expertise. And what do I mean by that? You as a person have your own expertise, and the most important expertise you have is about your own life. You are an expert in your life. You are an expert in what's important to your life, what keeps your family ticking, what keeps your family safe, how you're going to make a living, all this kind of stuff. Any epidemiologist is not. Any climate scientist is not. Any climate scientist, any random climate scientist is not an expert in the community you live in. You are an expert of that. If you are willing to just blindly trust what other experts are telling you, then you are ceding that authority of your own expertise. And I would encourage you not to do that. Does that mean blindly distrust the experts? No. That is not what that means in the slightest. My thing here with it is that experts are experts in their narrow field of expertise. They are not experts in your field of expertise. They are not experts in your life. So I very much say that if you are running into someone who is considering themselves, based upon their expertise, as someone who can tell you what to do and tell you that you should do this, you should do that, take that information, process it, take that knowledge that they're giving you and process it for your own life. You should listen to experts? Absolutely. Blindly trusting is not a good thing, necessarily. I don't think so, because that can lead to many poor decisions being allowed to happen here. You have to be involved and engaged in that decision, I think. So that's the thing is, and that's the other problem that I have with experts. I consider experts losing a lot of credibility and losing their expertise qualifications to me if they are saying, I'm going to tell you what to do. I know best for this situation. I'm going to tell you, you should do this. You should do that. You should do this. And particularly if they don't offer you a mea culpa when you did that and they were wrong about how it affected your life and ended up being horribly wrong. Yeah, they're not experts to me. If they are so set on telling you exactly what to do, this is what you should do. I don't listen to them. I don't listen to myself, and I am technically an expert in climate science, as I said. I don't listen to experts that tell me this is how you should live your life, necessarily. I take that information and process it and say, okay, this is what I'm going to do that meets that expert's needs, that expert's suggestion to me on what I should do that is best for my life at the same time. So I'm going to say it, yes, listen to experts, but not blind trust. And that leads me into my final thing here of, what is an expert? I always ask after reading these articles what's missing, and I've kind of hinted at it. So I do very much think an expert has knowledge and knowledge from experience or training, very concentrated often in a particular field. So it makes them an expert in something very particular, like me and climate science, or others like the mechanic, like the handyman I mentioned being an expert in plumbing and electrical and any number of different things. That doesn't necessarily have to come with a PhD. Expertise in something does not have to come with a PhD. It doesn't even have to come with a master's degree necessarily, but it can, and often it does. With some of our highest level experts, of course, with the most expertise and training, knowledge and training, I should say. With that knowledge, though, one of the things that I think defines an expert is an ability to think very critically with that field, that schema of knowledge that they have that is very concentrated in their particular field and somewhat, dispersed in other fields. But with that in mind, what is missing that I've kind of already hinted at it a few times is the idea of credibility here. Credibility and coming with, and I think the best way to wrap it up and define the credibility side of it is that an expert is someone with integrity, with a lot of integrity, willing to also have humility and recognizing that they are not experts in everybody else's life. And in the same breath, I as a person have to acknowledge that I'm not an expert in medicine, for instance. So I listen to other experts on COVID, for instance. Plenty of other experts on COVID, actually, a couple in my family. But I listen to those experts on COVID too, and that's the humility I recognize that I have. So that's kind of what I think is what defines an expert. someone with with expertise in a particular field. I'm using my own problem here. I'm circularly defining an expert with knowledge, either from training or experience, very, very important, connected to an own field, or you're an expert in your own life, for instance. Knowledge from experience or training in your own field, the ability to think very critically, so you're doubting, you're searching, coming to conclusion, sharing that with the public, or sharing that in a paper, or any number of different things. When it comes to scientists, I'm very much connected to the scientific method. You have integrity. You're an expert that has integrity. You're willing to take those mea culpas when you screw things up. You're willing to trumpet it from the rooftops, but also to then recognize with humility that you're not an expert in somebody else's life. You're not necessarily an expert in policy. I'm a climate scientist. I am not an expert in policy in the slightest, and I would not presume myself to be. It's one of the reasons why I don't make pronouncements on this is the policy we should follow. I'm not going to do that. Not my expertise. So yeah, I think that's the big thing. Lots of knowledge of a particular field, a subject particularly, based on training or expertise. Critical thinking skills to the nth degree. Integrity and humility. Those are the four biggest things that I use when I'm defining who is an expert or what is an expert to me. So that's my thoughts on the topic. Thank you all for listening. If you like this content, please like, share, comment, subscribe, all that good jazz. Here, getting the channel going. All that. Of course, if you want more, you're welcome to comment. Let me know. Let me know what you think. More thoughts, all this kind of stuff. I will link all of this stuff in the description for you, except for the one photo that's on a Locos page elsewhere. But and if you want more interactions with me directly, I also encourage you, again, go over to SciWorthy.locals.com. That will also be linked in the description. Become a member or a supporter there, and you will get to interact with me a lot more, because I'm going to do a lot more there than I am on Locals. So yeah, I think that's it for now. Thank you all very much for watching. Adrian here, signing off. Until next time, stay curious, my friends.